All right. Hey guys. So today's review is just going to be over boundaries, basically how they're established, the types of boundaries, and then finally, if you look down here, we got that ocean stuff, right? The ocean boundaries and how they actually work in global politics and things like that. All right. It's going to be a pretty easy day. You guys did this fairly well in class because it was one of those things that we were always able to easily review. Like I could say like, oh, what's this boundary look like between these two countries, and you guys could shout it out. So you guys shouldn't have too much trouble on it today, but we'll see. All right. So let's get into it. All right. Also, just a heads up, you need to try and log into AP Classroom and do the FRQ I have assigned you on AP Classroom. As soon as you log in, you should see that that FRQ pop up as like something you need to take care of. It shouldn't be too hard to find it. If it is difficult, I'll put out a video later about how to do it. Okay, so, oops, I need to share screen. All right, and there we go. So we're going into this, right? And this is all old stuff, but this was the PowerPoint on boundaries and boundary disputes. I always like you guys to have this. All right. There we go. So, boundaries, okay? Basically, boundaries are what separate countries, right? They're what separate states, they're what separate governments. Usually they're official, sometimes they are unofficial. It really just depends on the particular boundary when it comes to that. But what's really important is how do we actually find out where a boundary is? So, there's four main ways to do it, all right? They are define when you treat it like or you have a treaty-like document describing actual points on a landscape or latitude longitude points. All right, a boundary can be defined verbally or written, but the best way and the strongest way is written, so that's why most boundaries are written down. They are not just verbal. In the olden times they would just have verbal boundaries, things like that, because that would be easier to keep, right, or easier to establish. So if you see here, I'm going to move this video right here. You see up here, define, okay, and here I can stop share real quick. Define, all right. Big thing with the define, it's between physical landscapes, right? Come on, there you go. It's between physical landscapes, like between a mountain and a lake. So that red line would be our boundary between that mountain and that lake, all right? Or they can be along latitude and longitude lines. Like this one is saying that along that longitude line, all right, that will be a boundary. But boundaries can also go on latitude lines just fine. Okay, so that's pretty much all you need to know about.
You want to wait till noon?
Fine, right? So that's like kind of the first step. We're going to figure out what it is. And then the next step, we go over, we delimit it, we draw it on a map. Right, and it's hard to see due to.
I'm hungry now, but I'm like, I don't want breakfast.
Due to the there we go. So delimit. I'm gonna stop sharing real quick so you guys can see it. It's literally just drawn on a map, right? We draw a border between two nations with a pencil, with a pen, and then it is on a map and it's taken care of, right? So we have the landmass in the center. We got ocean on either side. We got a border. Guys, what area of the world do you think I based that landmass and border on? Kind of, sort of, maybe a little bit. All right, try and figure it out. Okay, so I'm going to go back to share screen. All right. So demarcate is where we use posts, walls, fences, etc. to mark a boundary. It's rare and expensive. It is becoming less rare simply due to the fact that the Trump administration wants to actually completely demarcate the boundary between America and Mexico. All right? That's very hard to do because it is expensive. They are wanting, the current administration wants to put billions of dollars into actually putting a fence between America and Mexico. And we've already seen people, it's not difficult to break that fence or get through that fence. So they want to demarcate a boundary. They want to demarcate this boundary to where it is porous. It is able to have holes and get through. If you guys really want to see my little drawing here, I put demarcate along a fence. All you got to do to remember, right? All you got to do. Demarcate is just the fence, okay? And then we've got right there you've got administrate, you determine how a boundary will be maintained and goods and people cross, all right? That's gonna be administrative, okay? So that's the border right there. They've demarcated a little bit with that, here, let me show you a little bit better. They've demarcated that border a little bit with that gate, but at the same time, it's really about this person right here figuring out who should be able to come through the border and who shouldn't, what goods should come through the border and what shouldn't, right? That means that this border is administrative, all right? So we're gonna go back, okay? So, and guys, the reason, if you see on the that political cartoon right there, dealing with Africa, right? And these are the European powers that are cutting it up. So what are they figuring out? What are they defining it, delimiting it, demarcating it, or administrating it when they're taking the idea of Africa, that cake of Africa, and splitting it up for each person? What are they trying to do here? What are they trying to do? And anyone can pop into chat and say,
Administrate.
"Oh, I know what it is." What are they trying to? How are they trying to affect these borders or make these borders, establish these borders? What are they doing?
Administrate, I think.
Where's I need my chat box. Okay. Nobody knows? Nobody knows? All right, I'm just gonna tell you, it's defined. They're basically saying, like, even though we don't see specific land points or specific landscape points or latitude and longitude points on that map, they're not actually, they don't have a map of Africa. They kind of just have, you know, the pie of Africa, right? They aren't actually going to put down boundaries like fences and walls, and they're not really talking about how to administrate it. They're purely talking about what areas each country should get. So that is really, really getting to defining, right? Because even though it's they don't have a particular latitude longitude point, they're talking about where the area is, right? So I just wanted to bring this up, and this is a great case of imperialism because all of these leaders represent different leaders in Europe, pretty much doing whatever they want to another place, right? So imperialism. All right. And then we have the types of boundary. We have that geometric boundary, that straight line boundary, totally unrelated to physical features. Great example, US-Canada border. All right. It is a fantastic example of a geometric boundary. All right. If you want to go in and watch the video on it, it's really, really great. There's also, we've watched a couple borders videos before by that guy who went into India and he like checked out the border between India and Pakistan and all that. He actually has a new one that came out over the course of the school year about America and Canada's border, where he's actually going and kind of like learning more about it and all that. It's pretty interesting. It gets into this idea of like how it started, all that stuff. So this video is good. You can also go watch the Vox Borders video on the border between Canada and the USA. All right. You can see it, the demarcation along the US-Canadian border. They actually cut a 20-foot wide path of trees. All right, 20, or I think it's 20 feet, but it's just this cut through all of the wilderness between the borders. All right, and it goes over mountains, goes over rivers, all that stuff. And basically, it's getting to this idea that they wanted a physical line in the sand between US and Canada, even though at the same time, you can just walk across it. That demarcation doesn't always have to block travel. It doesn't have to be a wall that you can't cross. It doesn't have to be a fence that you can't cross. It can just be a line drawn on the ground that you can walk over, all right? But that is still a demarcated point, okay? And it's still expensive to get, all right? Then we have the physical boundary. This is a major physical features that serve as means of separation. We see this in Europe, between Spain and France. We have the Pyrenees Mountains, which is basically this line of mountains that goes across this peninsula here that cuts off Spain and Portugal from the rest of Europe. And that is a physical boundary. That's the boundary that Spain and France decided would be their boundary. That would be their boundary, would just be these mountains right here because it's so difficult to get across it. All right. It stopped Spanish culture from diffusing north. It stopped French culture from diffusing south, and that's why they chose that physical boundary. All right, there's three types of physical boundary. All right, desert, mountain, and water. And water can be oceans, it can be rivers, it can be lakes, it can be any large body of water is going to be useful to make a physical boundary. All right, and desert boundaries can be effective because deserts are hard to cross and relatively unchanging. All right, they can expand and shrink as climate changes, but generally it doesn't really matter because you have people on opposite sides of a desert, right? So you have this big desert in the center, and you have country A on one side and country B on another side, a big desert in the center. It doesn't matter if that desert really gets bigger or smaller because you still have that desert between them that counts as a boundary. All right, this is a non-demarcated desert border between Mali and Mauritania in the Sahara. Right, there's nothing on the ground. It's just that's the desert. It's hard to cross that desert, so therefore that works as a boundary. All right. You see a lot of them in Africa. They are in northern Africa, I should say, and they're all over the place. All of this is just one of the harshest, largest deserts in the entire world. So a lot of these lines are pure, straight geometric lines, geometric physical borders, which is kind of an interesting connection there, because basically they're like, yeah, there's no point actually like getting down to the nitty gritty about who wants what in this area because we don't really want anything close to this border. So we're just going to say it's along this latitude and longitude line at this angle, right? We're going to say it's along this flat, straight line at this angle going across, okay? Like desert, mountains provide effective borders because of their inaccessibility and unchanging character. Mountains change even less than, the deserts, unless you have like a volcano that erupts and blows up a mountain or something like that. All right. Oh, is that my baby? Sorry guys, give me 1 second. Let me pause the video super fast. I think my daughter's trying to get in here. So give me 1 moment. Let me go check on her. Anything off? Okay. All right. Ah, she turned on the recording. Go. Resume recording. Sorry guys, that was my daughter. She wanted to come say hello. All right. Okay, so back to the borders. All right. Mountains, right? Inaccessible, hard to get over. They usually stop cultural diffusion or definitely slow it down a lot. So like this border between Chile and Peru, it's very lightly demarcated, right? They've just got a nice sign saying, hey, thanks for your visit. Welcome to Chile, all right? But at the same time, the reason they don't need to demarcate is because it's like, it's difficult to get over this border, right? They have to go through these specific mountain passes that are actually accessible by a vehicle. So they don't have to really worry about it that much, all right? We also have the mountain border between Spain and France through the Pyrenees, right? It actually stretches from one coast to the other, right? You can actually follow along these high mountain tops, okay? And that's the thing that caused French culture to not really diffuse into Spain too much and caused Spanish culture to not really diffuse into France too much. And you actually see here, there's this little country called Andorra, which is very, very small. And basically, they never got taken over by France or Spain a long, long time ago. They kept their independence. They basically kind of like Switzerland did. They basically played both sides, and they're very hard to physically take over with an army. So they were able to keep their independence. All right. Water boundaries can be much more problematic than the other two because while a water boundary provides a good demarcation, they can change over time. Okay. The U.S.-Mexico border along the Rio Grande, right? Or Rio Grande, as you like to say. But it starts up here, right? This is all a water border, but it can move. It can shift over time. It has shifted hundreds of yards over the course of Texas and Mexico being two separate entities. So water borders can cause issues to where nowadays, even if a water border is the unofficial border between Texas and Mexico, there are points of Mexico that actually now have like the southern bank of the Rio Grande, right? That's Mexico, or sorry, the northern bank of the Rio Grande is Mexico because the Rio Grande shifted, like, so if the, sorry, let me flip it around, right? Why can't I do this? There we go. So Rio Grande, right? It's like this, okay, or like this, all right? If it shifts south and suddenly this northern shore is Mexico, owned by Mexico, that's happened in places. There's also been places where it shifts north and suddenly America owns the southern shore because America and Mexico said, hey, this point right here, and they mapped it out with latitude and longitude and everything. They say, this is actually our border. And so even though the rivers can move north and south or east and west, right? Things like this can shift, okay? We still have our same official border. All right. And then, right, we see here, this is the Aral Sea. This is between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan today. When in 1960, when it was first affected, you guys see this little blue line up here? That's a river. And that's the only, or sorry, that river and this river down here both feed into the Aral Sea. And that's what kept the sea at the level it was. It's just a really, really huge lake, all right? And it was being fed by two rivers. But suddenly, they dammed up this river. They dammed up this river. They started doing other things with the water. They were taking it off. And the Aral Sea began to shrink. And suddenly, all of this land right here was uncovered. All of this land was uncovered. So this water border wasn't there anymore. So then they had to actually go in and officially say, all right, well, we own this half of this island, you own that half of that island. All right, we own all this land here, all that stuff, okay? So, and then we have relic boundaries, boundaries that cease to exist. However, the imprint of the boundary still remains on the cultural landscape. This is very easy to see in East and West Germany and East and West Berlin, all right? So much so that you can actually see the difference between West Berlin and East Berlin from space, because if we zoom in on Berlin right here, the western side used one style of light bulbs that was used by Western Europe, and the eastern side was using another style of light bulbs that was used by Russia and produced by Russia. All right. So, and like one of them is white, one of them is very yellow. All right. It's a very yellow color. So this difference can be seen from space in Berlin, where you see a demarcation, you see a line between a brightly yellow part of the city and a bright white part of the city. Now, over time, that's going to change because the government of Berlin is slowly changing those lights into newer lights and like solar powered lights and things like that. So they're going to look different over time, and that relic boundary will fade. All right. So relic boundaries, while they're set up by cultural actions, usually over time they begin to fade and fade and fade to where really there's little difference between both areas now. Okay. Another relic boundary that we should talk about for specifically America is the relic boundary of the Mason-Dixon line, which I'm going to show you a little bit. It's basically, it was the line between the North and the South during the Civil War, the Mason-Dixon line, and basically that line is still there are cultural imprints on that today, just in politics, racial politics. We can see it in accents and things like that, and history. How people interpret history is very different between the North and the South, and it's still there today. Even though, like certain places, like Texas, it happened before that they actively distanced themselves from that cultural history, and Texas more and more tried to say that no, we're the West. We weren't ever part of. We're not the South. We're the West, right? But you got to remember, Texas still fought on the side of the South in the Civil War, right? So, and then we have antecedent boundaries. These are boundaries that are defined and delimited before humans settle. So that's like in the case of Malaysia, where basically they set up this boundary before people really had settled that part of the country at all. All right. So you set up the boundary before people get there, right? So another example is this straight line between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. that was set up because they were like, look, this part of the island is very different from this part of the island. So we're going to say that we're going to divide the island in half, and that nation gets that part of the island. This nation gets this part of the island. There, we have a boundary. We don't have to worry about fighting over it or anything like that, or figuring out a boundary in the future. Then you have boundaries like in between China and Vietnam, which are very jagged and very, very connected to the people there. Because basically they went in and they asked everyone who lives in this area, hey, do you see yourself as Vietnamese or Chinese? And then depending on how the people asked, they made the boundary to fit to where majority of people who were saying they were Chinese ended up on the Chinese side. Majority of the people who were saying they were Vietnamese ended up on the Vietnamese side. Okay, so this is all about basically figuring out the cultural landscape and then putting down a boundary. Antecedent boundary, you put down the boundary first, and then the cultural landscape will flush out or like diffuse out to meet that boundary. Okay, so we're gonna go, before we get into the ocean boundaries, I'm gonna turn off this, and I'm just gonna run through this super quick. Kind of the drawings, right? Geometric, it's the dividing line between Canada and the USA. It's a straight shot all the way across. Then we have physical boundaries. Things like mountains, rivers, or deserts can separate country A from country B. Then we have a relict boundary. That would be like the Mason-Dixon line dividing the North and the South in the US. And then we have the antecedent, where we have one culture, the blue culture over here, we have the green culture over here, and they know about each other, but they haven't really spread out to cover this whole island. Maybe it's really, really mountainous in between, so it's kind of hard to live there. So instead they say, hey, we'll set a boundary here that gives both of our people plenty of room to spread out, all right? And then we have a subsequent boundary. This is an island that's very easy to spread out across, to where the blue boundary, they just kept spreading this way, right? The green boundary spread this way. And then they were like, you know what, we need an official boundary between our two nations. So they went in and they asked, and then they divided a boundary between them, okay? They just divided that boundary up. So those are the 5 types of boundaries. And then we're getting into, this is our ocean boundaries, right? Which, pretty easy. Just remember 12, 12, 200 rest. 12, 12, 200 rest. If you can remember that, you'll remember the UNESCO ocean boundaries very well. All right. Remember, they were defined in the 1982. So this is like less than 40 years ago. These were officially put down by the United Nations. It was the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, also called the UNCLOS. All right. And the whole focus of this was basically getting into what layers were what. How far out from a country's land, because humans are land creatures, how far out from a country's land do our rules and regulations and taxes and tariffs and things like that, how far do they reach out? All right. Territorial waters, basically exactly the same as on the land. That's 12 miles. Contiguous zone, they have control of that area and they can stop people from coming into their territorial waters. That's another 12 miles. All right. Exclusive economic zone. All right. That's 200 miles from the shore, from that baseline. All right. So really, the exclusive economic zone is only 176 miles out from the contiguous zone. Okay. Because you have to remember, you have the 12 nautical miles, you have the 12 contiguous miles, and then from the beginning of the 12 territorial waters, 12 territorial miles for water, 12 nautical miles for territorial waters, 12 nautical miles for contiguous zone, and then you have 200 miles, including those original 24 miles of exclusive economic zone. All right. And then after that 200, if it's not hitting anyone else's exclusive economic zone, it is international waters. All right. International waters. Completely without any economic regulation of the areas outside of the exclusive economic zone. All right. So territorial waters, it begins at the mean low water baseline, because guys, remember, we have you have currents and you have like tides. That's what I'm trying to think of, to where you have high tide and low tide. So you go at low tide, all right, and you have all, like, everything everything that is in that territorial water is controlled by whatever government is the land. Okay? 12 nautical miles out from that, states may exercise the control necessary to prevent others from infringing its customs, immigration, and other laws. Basically, those extra 12 miles give us a 12-mile border where we can say, hey, you can't come in here. Hey, you can't do your business here, all that stuff. Then you got your exclusive economic zone that's 200 miles out from the shore, all right, where you have exclusive control of economic resources like mining, oil, but you cannot prohibit legal passage and loitering. Basically, people can move through those exclusive economic zones fine, as long as they're not trying to take wealth from this area, right? If you're trying to take minerals, you're trying to fish, you're trying to pump oil out, right? That's a problem. You can't do that. But those 200 nautical miles give countries exclusive economic rights to those areas. And then you have everything else, which is going to be the high seas, international waters. They're not any national jurisdiction. They're going to be jurisdiction of the United Nations, right? If you want to watch a great video on it to give you a better understanding about how laws actually work in international waters, definitely watch that. It's important. I would say this is probably one of the best ones to watch to better understand these international waters. All right. And then we have our disputes. Okay. So we have definitional. Basically, this is getting into how we identify a border. How do we define that border? All right. So it's angry about the definition of the border. It's angry about the language used in the boundary agreement, that kind of thing. It's like, no, 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 no. I get all of the water in the river up until your side, and then that's your land. That doesn't seem fair. Usually, it's about the median line of the river. Okay. Then there's locational. Locational deals with delimitation and demarcation. So, as far as delimiting, where we draw it, if it's a line in an area that isn't accurate, all right, people can be upset about that vague line. They can be upset about the definition used. They can be upset about vague language. This was really important with internal African boundaries, to where now these nations that are becoming more and more independent, they were like, oh, anything like basically the old treaties and stuff would be like, yeah, this area, they would just have like circles and be like, this area is controlled by Belgium, this area is controlled by Portugal, this area is controlled by France, right? And they would just have these circles that weren't very exact because, frankly, the European powers weren't going to fight each other over stuff moving between those countries as long as they got what they wanted out of them. But then once those countries are now their own countries, right? Once those countries have independence and they need to get taxes and tariffs from trading between all three of those countries, they want effective borders, all right? So they'll have a locational dispute. They have an issue with where the location of a border is, all right? Or it can have like no definition. The area between Saudi Arabia and Yemen officially has no definition, right? Even though we draw it all the time with borders between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, there's not real definitions at this point, and it's causing problems where Saudi Arabian members or people in Yemen, members of different groups in Yemen, are actually fighting with each other, having an actual war because of a bunch of different reasons, but one of them is border disputes, right? And then you have operational. So this is about the function. How is the border between our two countries going to function? If one country believes, hey, we should have a completely open border, while another country says, no, we don't want an open border. You have to go through rigorous checkpoints and all that. We can have those operational disputes between governments. Usually operational disputes don't lead to like actual conflict, like physical conflict. But they can cause issues for like nomadic people that naturally move between borders or naturally move between nations. Migrant workers. We used to have a lot of migrant workers between America and Mexico, where we would have agricultural workers from Mexico coming to America during the picking season, picking fruits, picking vegetables, doing all that stuff. And then they would just go back home. And it was very easy for them to cross, and you didn't have as much anger and resentment about these people crossing the border because they were doing a job for America. That's changed over time to where we had an operational dispute with Mexico in the 70s, all right, where people were saying, no, we need to not allow that because frankly, in the 70s, it was about communists, and they were worried about communists coming into America. All right. So it was very silly. And then we have allocational, and this is all about how do we allocate the resources like water, like oil, like coal, like diamonds, rubies, things like that, like natural resources. How do we allocate those if we actually find them on the border? All right. So these can be subsoil resources like natural gas in Netherlands and Germany, where the Netherlands had to pay a bunch of money to Germany because they were pumping out a huge amount of Germany's natural gas, or it might be the other way around. I can't remember. And then there's also oil, that oil fields that can basically stretch between Iraq and Kuwait, right? And Iraq actually went in and attacked Kuwait over this allocational dispute. This is the boundary dispute that can lead to large wars. Basically, an allocational dispute between Iraq and Kuwait is what led to both Iraq wars, essentially, and the rest of the wars in the Middle East with America, because America wanted to go in and help our ally Kuwait to make sure that they had control of their oil fields and things like that. But at the same time, like, Kuwait was stealing Iraq's oil, so not great there. But then there's also like water supplies, like upstream or downstream, right? This is happening in the Middle East with the Tigris River, to where Iraq, right, uses a lot of the water that is going down the Tigris before it gets to Kuwait, and it's affecting Kuwait. All right. There's the Nile. So countries that are south along the Nile, because remember the Nile runs south to north. It actually runs backwards for most rivers in our world. So Egypt can get upset at rivers that are basically upstream, right, south of them, for using too much water and not having enough water getting downstream to Egypt, right? There's also it's also happening in Colorado, to where certain communities in Colorado are using the Colorado River too much, and people are getting upset because there's not enough water running down to other areas, because like there's these valleys in the center of Colorado that use a lot of water to grow a lot of agricultural crops, and they're using too much water before it gets to Denver, so then Denver has a water shortage. Not great. There's also the seafloor below coastal waters, where countries can get in arguments about, hey, you're taking our resources that are underwater, under the seafloor, below our exclusive economic zone. Because like, if you ever seen that Simpsons episode where they drill a oil well at an angle to go from the land that Mr. Burns owns, and he drills an oil well at like a 45-degree angle to take all of the oil from underneath the school that the school owns, right? That can happen on these coastal waters, and people can get very upset about that. All right. Oops. Let's keep going. Okay, that's it. So we got through all of them. I didn't have enough space to really go through and put in the types of conflicts, but just remember, they're definitional, they are locational, and operational and allocational. All right, so locational and allocational, very different. Locational, where's the boundary? Allocational, where's the stuff we want in our boundary? Definitional, all right? What are we gonna say is the boundary, right? Operational, how are we gonna cross that boundary? Okay. So let's real quick, I'm going to stop sharing, all right, my screen. I'm gonna pause the recording and ask if you guys have any questions. All right, nobody had any questions. There we go. Nobody had any questions about boundaries, so I'm just going to kind of go into my last spiel, which is basically, we've got 2 weeks. 2 weeks before the AP exam. All right, the AP exam is on the 12th. You guys will be taking it on the 12th. You have 2 weeks, 14 days to prepare for the AP exam. So all I'm doing today is going to be doing, or I'm going to be doing some grading. Actually, I'm going to grade some. And then also I'm going to go through and I'm going to start collecting things for you guys to study and to go through. If you haven't started studying yet, I highly advise you to go through and study. I will be putting out a list of who is already signed up to take the AP exam. If you're on that list, start studying, okay? The best thing for you to do right now, because I haven't got my completed list of things to push out for you to study, is to go through and watch those AP College Board videos, all right? Go through and watch the AP Human Geography videos. There's a huge playlist where it's a woman from Bel Air High School, and she's going through all of the information from this course. You can skip the 2 units. We don't have to know. The last 2 units, you can skip development. You can skip, what is it? What's the last one? Oh, urban. You can skip urban, right? All you need to know, geographical basics, right? That first unit, population, culture, agriculture, and politics, right? Those are the 5 you really need to know. Those are the 5 you need to study. Go through those, watch those, and you'll be all set for, not all set. You should also do more studying. It's a difficult test, and it's kind of a bummer because it's going to be 2 FRQ questions. That's the entire test. And if you're unlucky and you get through both questions and you're like, I didn't remember those 2 things, it's going to be very difficult. If you don't know what those 2 things are, it's going to be very difficult for you to do really well on the AP exam. It's a bummer, but you know, coronavirus. Please stop.